Let's talk now to Charles Adiogun Phillips. Mr. Phillips is a former International Criminal Court prosecutor who joins us virtually. Good morning to you. Thank you for your time.
Morning, laddie. How are you? Happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you too. How are activities and actions in situations of war or conflict defined? We have heard loosely in different statements some actions being described as war crimes, some as crimes against humanity, and others still as genocide.
Well, there are 4 international crimes that are relevant to the atrocities and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Those crimes are the war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the international crime of aggression. Crimes against humanity are described as certain acts that are purposefully committed by a state or on behalf of the state as part of a widespread and systematic policy, which is targeted essentially at civilians in times of peace or war. It's the violent nature of such acts that makes them being considered as a breach of human rights, hence the name a crime against humanity. On the other hand, war crimes are essentially violations of international humanitarian law, either by treaty or by customary international law, that incur individual criminal responsibility under international law. These atrocities are often committed against the civilian population, but they usually are conducted during war. A war crime could include murder, extermination, enslavement, and deportation, or even mass systematic rape. Genocide, on the other hand, are considered as acts that are committed with an intention to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, or racial group or religious group identified as such. So what is peculiar about a genocide and what makes it very, very difficult to prove is that you have to demonstrate that there was an intention to destroy in whole or in part members of a group. So those are the essential elements. The crime of aggression, of course, is based on the invasion of one country by another. So there are 4 international crimes that will be applicable here.
Given the way you've defined them, am I right to presume then that how you go about investigating and prosecuting these 4 are different?
Indeed, because the elements of the crimes are different. For example, a crime against humanity will differ from a war crime because a crime against humanity are not isolated acts or sporadic events committed by individual soldiers. Rather, a crime against humanity are acts committed in furtherance of a state or government policy. It has to be condoned by a government. Now, secondly, war crimes, unlike war crimes, crimes against humanity can be committed both during peacetime and during a war. A crime against humanity, a war crime rather, can only be committed during a war. Now, also a war crime would also most likely be committed by individual soldiers or members of armed forces during a time of war. Now, like I said, a genocide is very unique in that to prove a genocide, it has to have been the killing or the killing of an individual must have been committed with a special intent, what we call in international criminal law, the dodo specialis. It's a special intent to destroy in whole or in part members of a group. And that the targeting of members of that group must be based on either national, ethnic, racial, or religious grounds. And that group has to be identified as such. So for example, using the case of Nigeria, for armed forces or for people to have committed a genocide, members of a group such as the Yorubas, there must have been an intention to destroy that Yoruba group in whole or in part. So that special intention is what distinguishes a genocide from any of the other crimes. So they're all different in terms of the elements that support the prosecution of those crimes, yes.
With the war in Ukraine in particular and the current inability of neutral or independent observers to get in and assess the situation on the ground, how easy or difficult would it be to sustain accusations of any of these: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, international crimes of aggression, when the conflict eventually winds down? Because it does appear as if that cannot be investigated while the conflict is still on.
Actually, it can, and that's perhaps what distinguishes the ongoing conflict in Ukraine from many of the atrocities that I have investigated as head of special investigations at the UN. The investigation of violations in an active conflict, which was previously life-threatening, has now become a lot easier, thanks to what we call open source investigation techniques. Now, you wouldn't believe how easy it is in the days of digital mobile phones, digital equipments that are uploaded on social media by combatants themselves. And these videos are of such high resolution that they can be used as evidence in a criminal prosecution. But more importantly, there is an increased use of satellite imagery. Satellite imagery, as we've seen in this conflict, has been used a lot. When we investigated the Rwandan conflict 25 years ago, there was very limited use of satellite imagery, France and the US had that, and we had to rely on the US government to supply us with satellite imagery. But that now is readily available. Drones are flying all over the place. So it's actually very possible these days to actually capture events that are occurring real time. Now, there are quite a few techniques that investigators can use in documenting and preserving the evidence, irrespective of the fact that they are unable to gain access to the territory because of an active conflict. I've mentioned the use of open source intelligence, which is going to hospitals, looking at infrastructure that is targeted by the opposition forces, looking at places like hospitals and schools, the use of cluster bombs, the desecration of the remains of civilians or even fighters, the use of war crimes, sexual violence. Sexual violence is used as a tool of war, and that has been prevalent in every war. So the use of open source intelligence can help gather the information, irrespective of the fact that you're unable to gain access. The use of the ability to verify those sources. Again, I've mentioned the use of social media. One has to be, it's one thing to collect the imagery and to collect the evidence. It's another thing to be able to verify the evidence. So you would find that it's necessary for investigators using various metadata tools to be able to verify. But it's also important for investigators to be able to archive this evidence. Because you see, like I said, they exist on social media and they can be deleted by Twitter, by Facebook, just like that. So as you come into, as you gather the evidence and you find the evidence, you then archive it. And this is very interesting for what we did in Syria many years ago. When you find the evidence, the digital evidence, you then need to find eyewitnesses that are capable of corroborating. So it's one thing to find a video going around of soldiers doing things or bodies lying in the place. You'd now need eyewitnesses to be able to corroborate and to speak to those videos. You also need to be able to identify perpetrators. And there's so many techniques of identifying perpetrators. Where did the soldiers come from? Was there something unique about their uniforms? Did they have any insignia? The weapons used, were they derived from a certain manufacturer of weapons? The tanks, did they have any inscription on them, which would help investigators denote and decipher that these tanks and this ammunition belong to one side or the other? But like I said, the use of satellite imagery is very important in tracking the movement of forces. So you see, one of the things we use in international criminal investigation is to be able to say, well, these detachments of forces were located at this location at a particular time, and then tie them down to the atrocities that were committed at that location. And I'm sure you would have been familiar with a lot of satellite imagery showing the movement of Russian tanks in certain areas in Ukraine. These imageries should not be taken for granted. They're very useful. The analysis
Mr.
of
Adeogo, I'm sorry to interrupt you. My apologies. I'm sorry. We're due for a quick break. When we come back, you finish that thought, and I'll ask the other part of the questions that I still have for you. Please stay on with us. Thanks for staying tuned. Mr. Charles Adeogo Phillips, former ICC prosecutor, is still our guest from Victor Island here in Lagos, joining us virtually. Mr. Adeogo, before Phillips, before the break, you were just concluding the fact that, you know, it's one thing to gather the material, it's another thing to verify. But even there, with verification, there are tools that can help, and how you go about using those tools will also be critical to how the matter is eventually proceeded with. But crimes of this nature are prosecuted, investigated by the ICC, but a number of the parties in this particular conflict, talking about the one in Ukraine, they are not signatories to the Rome Statute, which set up the ICC. Is it possible, perhaps, that a non-signatory can bring a case before the ICC for investigation and prosecution?
Yes, it is. But before I answer that, let me start off by saying that the likelihood of President Putin standing trial as a serving head of state is extremely slim. That said, if the Russian government, the current Russian government, falls, and he is then removed from office and extradited by the new regime with more cordial relations with the international community, then of course that would happen. We're all witnesses to the case in Sudan and how difficult it has been to bring President al-Bashir to be accountable for his atrocities in Darfur. Now, can the ICC make President Putin accountable for the invasion of Ukraine? In theory, yes. In practice, no. Now, President Putin's actions in targeting Ukrainians, in targeting civilians in Ukraine constitute war crimes, and crimes against humanity under international law. So it is possible for the ICC prosecutor to proceed with an investigation of these crimes, because even though Ukraine is not a party to the Rome Statute of the ICC, it had previously accepted the court's jurisdiction in 2014 in connection with Russia's invasion of Crimea, which you rightly pointed out. It then went on to accept the ICC's jurisdiction on an open-ended basis. So the ICC has both the subject matter and the temporal jurisdiction over these events. Now, that said, I'm not sure that it can be shown through the evidence that the certain acts that were committed in Ukraine were committed with an intention to destroy in whole or in part Ukrainians as a national or racial group. So I worry about the sustainability of a genocide charge. Genocide is the crime of crimes. It's very, very, very rare to prove. But his actions in invading Ukraine also constitute a violation of the international crime of aggression. Now, I have you know that the crime of aggression has never been prosecuted. It only exists on paper. And there's certain limitations to the ICC's ability to prosecute Mr. Putin for the crime of aggression. Because on the face of it, invading Ukraine would suggest that Russia is guilty of the crime of aggression. But there are certain limitations. And those limitations are this. The first limitation is that the alleged aggressor, in this case Russia, must be a state party to the Rome Statute of the ICC. Russia is not a state party to the ICC, and therefore its citizens cannot be prosecuted by the court for this specific offense. And this is limited to the crime of aggression. So there are other options. I don't know how much time we have, but there are other options that could be pursued. And you must have heard talk about the creation of a special international tribunal just to prosecute Putin for the crime of aggression. The idea being that that international tribunal will take care of the crime of aggression, whilst the ICC will take care of the other violations of international criminal law, such as crimes against humanity and war crimes. The general idea is that both institutions will run pari passu. So in a nutshell, that is the answer to your question.
My final question to you in this segment, I wish we had more time, but I want to find out that you have mentioned how this is supposed to proceed. But assuming, and you've also talked about the technology available, but there are countries which have, in the run-up to this discussion, which have said that, you know, observers should be allowed to go in and actually examine the physical evidence on the ground, see all the various things on the ground. Now, if they get in, if that ever happens, before most of the evidence is removed or destroyed, either directly or inadvertently, what are some of the things that, you know, they'd be looking out for within the grounds?
Yeah, well, it is as clear as night follows day that there have been serious violations of international humanitarian law by the Russian military and or its leadership. That's clear. It's all over the news. So very quickly, if I was directing those investigations, they would cover three main areas. The first area I have alluded to is deriving eyewitness testimony from the survivors of some of this attack and trying to match the digital evidence, which should have been recorded either the use of satellite imagery or through drones or electronic materials such as mobile phones, trying to match those to eyewitness testimony. The second would consist of detailed forensic evidence. And the third would consist of obtaining intelligence from insider witnesses. Now, let me tell you a bit about what I consider forensic evidence. Now, forensic evidence will consist of exhumation of mass graves and the examination and documentation of what was contained in those mass graves. When I was involved in the Rwanda genocide, one of the first things that we had to do upon taking on that job was to be present as forensic examiners would dig up mass graves. And the whole idea was to be able to identify as prosecutors who the victims of those crimes were by virtue of their sexes, the clothes they were wearing. Luckily for us, the soil in Rwanda was so rich, so the bodies had not decomposed to a state where we couldn't recognize them. And we were able, with the assistance of eyewitnesses who could identify their relatives or the remains of their relatives in these mass graves, we begin to start to pin together a picture of what took place in a particular location. Forensic evidence would also consist of the examination of ballistic evidence, and the ballistic in terms of the weapons that were used. You need ballistic experts to be able to speak to the origins of those weapons. Where were they manufactured? Who are they banned by the UN? What's the country of origin? We would need the help of NATO allies to be able to examine this. But more importantly is the use of satellite imagery. Satellite imagery, with the help of NATO allies, will help locate the movement of Russian forces at a particular location, at a particular time, and that would enable investigators to be able to tie them to the atrocities that took place at that location.
Indeed, but all of this, of course, is for those who are waiting and prepared to do this. But we'll have to wait and see. Mr. Adeogo Phillips, thank you so much for the perspective. We'll bring you back when we have a lot more facts and less heat about this to talk about what is going on then. For now, thank you so much for your time this morning. And once again, compliments of the season.
Thank you.